Hi, good morning everybody, and thank you for joining our latest webinar. Today's webinar is in celebration of International Women's Day, and it's really important that we think about the number of women within our workforce. We know that there were 3.5 million people, women over 50 in the workforce totally, and there were just under 1 million working in the NHS. So if we know on average that women go through the menopause at 51, we can work out how many of our peers and colleagues are within that cohort right now. And yet we don't have this conversation. So I wanted to take the opportunity to talk with Helen Ashley, our retention manager, around what the menopause feels like, how we can be better, and I speak as a male manager in this space, but really how we can be better allies, how we can represent and understand better the health needs of our colleagues, and how we can work more consistently and understandably together, really. So hopefully this conversation will highlight and answer some of the questions and the queries that I know people have. I'm learning in this space as a man. Obviously I don't experience the menopause, but I really want to be the best ally I can be. So hopefully together we'll learn a bit more. Helen, over to you. How are you today? Happy International Women's Day, incidentally.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and happy International Women's Day to you too. I'm very well, thank you. Nice to see you, and thank you for this opportunity to have this chat. It's such an important topic, and I'm delighted that we're able to focus on it a little bit.
I'm really grateful you could join me. I think it's so important, so important. So first of all, Helen, so tell us, so again, as a man coming into this space, and I don't assume that men don't know anything about this space, because obviously we have mothers and sisters and partners and we know a bit, but tell us from your perspective and from the woman's perspective what the menopause is.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to make it completely clear to everybody that I'm not a clinical person in any way. I work in HR, I'm a people specialist, so let's just put cards on the table straight away that I'm not clinical. I'm not able to offer any clinical advice, but from my perspective, menopause is part of the reproductive journey, the reproductive history of women. So in different stages of our lives, we produce more and less estrogen. We have a period of fertility, and the menopause is the end of that period of reproductive fertility when estrogen production in your body falls, and you experience, some people more, some people less, symptoms associated with that change of hormone production.
You're on mute. Anthony, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, Anthony, I can't hear you, my love. You're on mute.
I was muted. I hate that mute button. So I've been prompted in the chat box because in my ignorance, I made a reference to the age that people go through menopause. Now, clearly, from the note in the chat, and of course, thinking about what I know and being a bit more insightful than my original comment, I'm aware that women do go through menopause at different ages. So I did mention over 50. Of course, our cohort is significantly bigger than that. Tell us a little bit about how people are individually impacted by menopause. So what I do know is that symptoms are really different for different people and can be really inconsistent. Tell us a little bit about what some of the effects can be.
So one of the interesting things about a change in hormone production level of anybody, so if anybody goes through any change in hormone production for any reason, you'll find, I think, that not only is it different from one person to another, but it's also different within your individual experience. So you can't say, I'm going through the menopause, I am experiencing headaches, because you might today, you might not tomorrow. One person experiences extreme symptoms sometimes, all the time, none of the time. So it is an extremely personal experience. And the symptoms can be myriad. So there are some that come to the fore when people think about menopause. They think about hot flushes, they think about anxiety, maybe they think about night sweats, insomnia. Those are some of the symptoms, certainly, but you can also experience muscle aches, you can experience shortness of breath, you can experience faintness. So there are an awful lot of symptoms that could form part of your personal experience.
But given everybody's story can be different, then we've established the symptoms can be very different and inconsistent for people. Then, so do people always know that what they're experiencing is part of the menopause?
No, not at all. And I think pinning down your point of now I'm going through the menopause is problematic, because it depends on what your normal hormonal levels were before, what they are now. It's a biological process, isn't it? So it's never going to be mathematically trackable. So I can think of friends of mine who've gone through the menopause without even noticing. You know, they had contraceptive implants, so their periods had stopped, and so they went through the whole menopause none the wiser. And I know other people whose lives have been turned upside down by it. So it's not an easy thing by any means to be aware of, even when you're going through it. It can pass you by, or it can hit you like a truck.
So that sounds really impactful then on all elements of your life. How long can it go on for?
So again, it depends on the length of that piece of string. So for some people, it takes a relatively short amount of time. So it can be within a year. The process will take its course, and you can be said to be through the menopause. Again, we're straying a little bit on clinical definition territory here, which I'm going to avoid. For other people, it can be 10, 12 years of very slow and gradual change.
So again, really inconsistent then, and difficult, because not kind of measurable or in the way that we might think about other health conditions.
No, and if you think about it, it's similar in many ways to the front end of your reproductive health. So as a teenage girl, it's very difficult to say where that transition takes place. You know, your periods start and they stop, and for some youngsters it's a very dramatic, and for others it's a very gentle process. So it's that story of women's reproductive health, really. It's just part of that story, and so it can be very very different.
So you've touched on some of the physical impact of it. Tell me about the broader kind of social effects and symptoms. So it sounds impactful on every element of your life. Tell me a little bit about that.
So this I find really fascinating, because it's a part of a woman's life, and for some reason that I'm not entirely clear on in my own mind, to be honest, it's not something that we talk about. In preparing for this session, I had a chat with my teenage daughter, and we went through her biology books at school, and they spend a lot of time talking about the teenage years in terms of women's reproductive health, and we couldn't find anything at all about the menopause in terms of a whole journey through a woman's life. And if you compare menopause, for example, with pregnancy, which is another part of some women's reproductive life, menopause gets almost no coverage. You know, if you're pregnant and you feel sick, there seems to be no stigma attached to saying that. You know, you've got aches and pains, you're feeling ill, nauseous. That seems to be socially acceptable to talk about. If you have very similar symptoms going through the menopause, you have fatigue, nausea, headaches, it seems to be still something of a taboo for some reason to talk about that, and that there seems to be a social stigma attached to that portion of our life in a way that's not the case in other parts.
Why do you think people are so uncomfortable talking about it? I mean, we're having a conversation about it. I appreciate this isn't a conversation everyone feels able to have. We're having this because we agreed it was an incredibly important conversation to have. Why do you think other people don't have those conversations?
I think it's a very difficult thing to gauge, isn't it? Not everybody is sure of who they're talking to. You know, I mean, one of the nice things about this conversation between us, Anthony, is that I'm very confident that you are very supportive. I think that's really essential, that the person that you're talking to, that you feel confident that they're going to listen with empathy, with a wish to understand better. And I think that makes a huge difference. Not everybody is sure of that reception, I think, when they have those conversations, and it makes it very difficult to broach that sometimes. So clearly I'm a bloke, but obviously I'm also a manager then. So in my role as a line manager, what do I need to know to do my job better and to be the best ally I can be in having a honest, transparent conversation to fully understand all of my team's healthcare, my duty of care? What would I need to know to kind of frame that conversation in a more insightful way, I guess? I think for me, the first thing is to avoid making any assumptions. So as a manager, I think you can only say what you see. So if you see somebody who looks uncomfortable, who looks unwell, that's where you start the conversation. I think it would be very foolish to dive into a conversation assuming that you know what's going on with a person. I think if you can just say what you see and ask that person how they are, then it puts the control in the hands of the right person in that sense. So then it's up to me to decide what I want to talk about, what I'm confident in saying to you. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that a member of your team needn't speak to you, that they might prefer to speak to somebody else. And I think it's important for you not to be hurt by that. It's nothing personal, but it is every employee's choice. You know, if they're not comfortable speaking to a manager, they can speak to a HR, they can speak to occupational health, they can speak to a number of other people. And I think part of your duty of care is to make sure that your team know that variety, know that range is available.
That's really helpful, and I guess that it also makes a difference individually as to whether your manager is male or female, because you may feel more comfortable or you may not feel more comfortable disclosing this to perhaps someone who's experienced it or will experience it, rather than someone of a different gender.
I think so. I mean, there was an interesting article in The Guardian this morning, a piece of research about how willing women are to disclose that their sickness symptoms, for want of a better word, are related to the menopause. And their research suggested that still more than half the workforce is unwilling to disclose that they are feeling ill because of the menopause, which I thought was really fascinating. So there's clearly still an issue for staff around saying truthfully, I feel ill or I'm suffering from this symptom because of the menopause. It's still not comfortable for women to say that in the majority.
So if we look back a bit then, so we know it can go on for a while. We know the symptomology is really varied, individually varied, and can be different things to different people at different times. If we think about dealing with this holistically, which is really what we're saying, isn't it? Thinking about people as a person and not with the symptoms that they present. Why do you think women are nervous about talking about it? Do you think this is because that it makes them feel less able to do their jobs, or concerned they might be perceived less able to do their jobs, or in fact that it might go on for an undefinable length of time? What's your sense about that?
I think part of the problem is that women feel unsure how this information is going to be received. I think if you compare it with pregnancy, for example, there is clearly defined legislation around how pregnancy is handled in the workplace. That is not the case yet with regards to menopause. And so that's one aspect. I think another aspect is that wider social stigma still, that it somehow in some places with some people it seems okay to make a joke about the menopause or to make remarks about hot flushes or being a woman of a certain age, or and I think we have to be very clear that it's not okay. It's not okay to make fun of people or to make cheap shots at any time, in any case. I don't know why it should be okay in this case, because clearly it's not, but I think maybe it still goes on.
Isn't it odd though that as part of a women's reproductive health continuum, that, as you say, we celebrate one end but don't talk about the other end? Isn't that bizarre?
It really is remarkable, bizarre. Isn't it? It is really remarkable bizarre. that we've not that we don't look at it as a whole story. I think for me that's part of the problem, that we kind of compartmentalize different parts of our lives instead of saying this is an inevitable part of a whole story and treat it as such.
So is there so if a colleague didn't want to discuss this, I'll use myself as an example. So if I had someone in my team, so as a male manager, somebody who didn't want to disclose that to me, perfectly understandably, how could I signpost them to somebody who could help them? So is it occupational health? Is it HR? What's the best place, the most supportive place to signpost somebody to?
I would say the first place to go would be your friendly HR advisor, because they will have in their hands all of the links and resources that you're going to need, and you can have that confidential conversation completely privately. And that's one of the reasons that HR is there. It's there to support you as an employee, and it's part of their job, and they're very good at enabling you to access the help and resources that you need. So that would be my natural first port of call, I think.
And do we have any, for managers who kind of want a bit of a frame around this, do we have policies and procedures that we need to kind of acquaint ourselves with? Or is it about much more of a holistic conversation, or is it a bit of both?
So the NHS England has a really fantastic first-rate menopause network. If you're not connected with that, I can strongly recommend that you join that group. A couple of weeks ago, they did an absolutely fascinating podcast about pelvic floor. And I watched it, and my daughters watched it, and it was just so full of information. It was specialist physio that did it, but they've got heaps of resources, and I think they are working on, or they've just got to the point of being ready to publish a policy, a draft policy document that is going to be available. So that'll be very useful.
That would be really helpful. Do you have any information on that group that you could either send to us for us to circulate or to post in the chat?
Yeah, I'll ping the link in.
That would be
so
really
that
good.
colleagues can, yeah.
We've got a number
absolutely.
of people listening today, and I know that we will be listening to some people who already know about this, but also I do want to reach out to people who need to learn more, or who can share it with people who want to learn more. And as always with these webinars, we are recording them, so we can share this post today if people can't join us, and we'll be putting it on our EDI hub. On that subject,
yeah, the chair of that group is a lady called Jackie McBurney, so I'll put her email address in as well.
And then people can reach out, can't they? That'd be really helpful. And Evo's also posted our Survey Monkey, which each of the webinars we're asking people to give us any feedback about what they found most helpful, but also what they've learned through them, and also to seek suggestions for future webinars that we can put on allied to cultural and diverse calendar events. So please do take a few minutes to complete that survey. We've still got plenty more questions for Helen. I just wanted to remind people that that is there. So kind of thinking then about the policy and procedure piece, and I think I know the answer to this already, but I am presuming therefore what we've heard and what you've said, that there's no way that menopause is a performance management issue.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Performance is impacted by how we feel, of course it is. And some days we have good days and some days we have less good days, but it's a health and well-being issue. It's not a performance issue.
And is there anything in terms, so if we think of other so in other health conditions or health related circumstances, people need sometimes to work differently, and we loosely use something that we call a reasonable adjustment, and that sounds really formal. What it really just means is ways of helping people work differently. So what might be some of the things that as managers we could put in place to help you to work differently then, having heard what we've heard?
So I had a look on the ACAS website quite recently, just looking at what their advice was about reasonable adjustments. And the ACAS perspective is that a reasonable adjustment is anything that helps you meet the requirements of your role. So they were looking at things like, have you got access to cold water? Have you got proper ventilation? Is your uniform suitable? Have you got access to breaks? Those kinds of things. So things that will help you to perform your job to the best of your abilities. And they were just a couple of the things that the ACAS suggested as possible options. So
in really extreme cases, and we do know that there's a kind of a continuum, isn't there, of how people experience menopause. In really, really serious circumstances, do people sometimes need to take time off sick?
Yes, absolutely they do. I mean, if you imagine, so for example, if you suffer from a migraine, we know, don't we, that migraines can be so debilitating that people can't even lift their head off the pillow. And likewise with menopause, some people are so badly impacted by this change in hormone that they have extreme fatigue, they can have extreme bouts of insomnia, they can have extreme bouts of anxiety, and those are all cases where you are not fit for work in those circumstances potentially, and that then the sickness policy kicks in to support you, that you have time off because you're unfit for work.
So going back to the previous conversation though, if an individual didn't want to have that conversation with a line manager, they could go straight to HR in that circumstance, couldn't they? And say, I'm off sick because, I mean, you can self-certificate for up to 5 days in any case. However, should it go past that time and people don't want to have that conversation, there are ways and means where that information can be gathered and shared without necessarily having to go to your immediate line manager.
I think what you're doing there is looking at symptoms and causes. So if you are suffering from extreme insomnia, for example, that is a symptom. So that might be what you choose to say. I can't come to work because I'm suffering from extreme insomnia. I think it's sensible course to have a conversation, as you say, if not with your line manager, with HR, in a more holistic sense, because that's where we've got services like occupational health, where you can say, look, I've got this basket of symptoms. I think they're all connected to the fact that I'm going through menopause, and I need some more support. I need some help and support. And partly you'll be having that conversation potentially with your practice nurse or your GP as part of your general health conversations. But I think it's very well worth having those conversations at work to get connected with as much support as you can. And again, you know, I have to compare it with pregnancy. We don't go through pregnancy on our own. I certainly didn't. I got all the help I could. My goodness, and I don't think that that I would do anything differently with any other element of my health and well-being.
Do you think then, so you know, across the NHS system we have champions around certain things, so mental health first aiders, equality champions. Is there a role, do you think, and a need for menopause champions, maybe, or, you know, a point of contact where people can go and have honest, confidential conversations about what they're experiencing?
That's a really good question, and I'd be really interested to know what the others who are listening to this conversation think, because I think there's pros and cons, aren't there? I think on one hand, I would wish we lived in a world where that was not necessary, that menopause was part of everyday conversation, that we don't need a champion or a specialist. However, I'm not so naive as to imagine that we live in that world yet. So it might be that champions help us to get where we need to go in terms of just normalising this topic, so it's no longer something that anybody feels reticent about.
So if people listening to this or other people, so just looping back then, so you're part of this call with me because you're part of our wider team. We work together in the People Directorate, but also you've been doing some national work on menopause. You're linked in, aren't you? So is there an opportunity here for people to feed ideas and comments via you into that national work? Yes,
please. That would be very gratefully received. So one of the pieces of work that we're doing in the retention team is a 55. We call it the 55 plus Vanguard, and as I said it, I thought, oh, that's not helpful, is it? But we're doing a Vanguard on people in the final third of their career, if you can imagine your career being in 3 phases. And so we're looking at how we can support people to have the career that they want at that stage. So colleagues are very, very welcome to get in touch and let me know what they think about how we might achieve that.
Okay, that's fantastic. And where I'm mindful of time, would it be possible for you to put your email address in the chat should people want to be able to reach out to you? Would that be okay?
I will. I'll shut up now if you. I can't talk and type at the same time, so I'll be quiet for a minute and I'll put the links in the chat box now, if that's okay. Okay,
that's great. That's perfect. Helen, thank you so much. So you've talked about the national work and you've put a couple of links into the chat. What support is apart from what you've already talked about, is there any other support available to colleagues in the NHS that we can signpost people to?
I'm in trouble now, aren't I? Because you see, I was pushing buttons and I shouldn't have been pushing buttons. I apologise. Yes, so there are a number of resources and groups that are available that I'm going to put in the chat that hopefully people will be able to access. So I'll do that in just a moment.
That's really, really helpful. Mindful of time, are there any takeaway messages that you'd like to share? So I've learned huge amounts. It's always lovely to talk to you, but on this subject, it's particularly fascinating. I think that I've learnt loads. Is there anything that you would like to give as a takeaway message then to other people listening, or that you'd like people listening to take away to share with colleagues about kind of raising awareness?
So I think for me, the headlines are that everybody goes through this in a different way, and the ownership, the control belongs to the member of your team. I think the message for managers is that you can only say what you see. And if we can avoid making assumptions, if we can be open and approach this issue with an intention to listen and learn, that will be the right direction, I think.
Great, Helen. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody who's been listening. Thank you for everybody for your questions and your comments. As I say, we will record this. It will go on the EDI hub, and Helen has offered to deal with any questions or be able to signpost people to where they can get information. Oh, there's another a question just appeared in the chat. Could you also share details for ACAS reasonable adjustments? If that's okay. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen. Have a great.
It's my pleasure, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for your honesty and you're just being so articulate and such a champion around this. It's amazing. Thank you so much.